Every boy wants a Remco toy. You heard that line 1,000 times. On your television, between cartoons, between westerns, between everything. A voice, confident, certain, like it was stating a law of nature, said those 6 words and you nodded because it was true. You did want a Remco toy. You wanted the tank that rolled across your bedroom floor and fired plastic shells at your sister's dollhouse. You wanted the bazooka that launched projectiles hard enough to dent a garbage can lid. You wanted the walkie-talkie that let you talk to your best friend from 50 feet away as if you were soldiers behind enemy lines. Every boy wanted a Remco toy, and then Remco vanished. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you are watching from. The walkie-talkies came first. That was how Remco started, and that was what Remco was. 2 plastic boxes connected by the idea that a boy on one end of the street should be able to talk to a boy on the other end. They were heavy. They ate batteries the way a dog eats table scraps, fast and without apology. The range was terrible. 50 feet on a good day, 30 feet on a bad one, and if your friend walked behind a tree, you lost him entirely. The static was louder than the voice. You had to press the button and say "over" when you were done talking. Not because the device required it, but because that was how soldiers talked, and you were a soldier and your friend was a soldier and the backyard was a battlefield, and the walkie-talkies made it real. They crackled, they hissed, they ran out of batteries in the middle of an operation that was saving the world from an enemy whose identity changed depending on what movie you had seen that week. And when the batteries died, you had a choice. Go inside and ask your mother for new ones, which meant explaining why you had used up 4 D cells in 2 hours, or go find your friend in person, which defeated the entire purpose of having walkie-talkies. You always went inside, you always asked, and your mother always said the same thing: those batteries are not growing on trees. But the walkie-talkies were just the beginning, because the men who made them were not toy designers. They were engineers, military engineers, and the things they built next were not toys in the way that a doll is a toy or a ball is a toy. They were machines, small plastic battery-powered machines that did things, real things, loud things, things that made noise and moved and fired projectiles and smoked and broke and drove your parents out of their minds. The Bulldog Tank was the one you begged for. A dark green plastic tank with rubber treads and a turret that rotated and a cannon that fired small plastic shells. It came with a wired remote control, a big yellow or gray box with buttons that you held in your hand while the tank crawled across the floor. Forward, reverse, turn left, turn right, fire. The shells popped out of the cannon with a sound that was louder than it should have been and traveled farther than the box said they would and hit things that were not supposed to be targets, and you said it was an accident, and your father said it better not happen again, and it happened again. The batteries lasted about 40 minutes. Then the tank slowed down. The turret stopped rotating. The treads started grinding instead of rolling. And you sat there with the remote in your hand, pressing the buttons harder as if pressure would squeeze more life out of the cells, watching the Bulldog Tank die on the kitchen floor like a real tank in a real battle. You changed the batteries. You did this 3 times a day until your father told you he was not buying any more batteries until next month. And then there was the bazooka. The Remco bazooka was a green plastic tube about 3 feet long that fired foam or plastic projectiles with enough force to make a satisfying thump when they hit the garage door. One boy's uncle modified his, adjusted the spring, widened the barrel until it could launch dirt clods and golf balls across the yard. That boy got banned from the neighborhood war games. He could only play if he left the green tube at home. That is a real story told by a real man who still remembers the day the neighborhood decided his Remco bazooka was too much. The monkey division was Remco's answer to every boy who wanted to be a soldier but could not join the army for another 10 years. It was a complete military kit, not a toy. A kit, a helmet, a canteen, a belt, a holster, walkie-talkies, grenades that you threw at imaginary enemies behind the azalea bushes, a rifle, everything a boy needed to wage war on the block from breakfast to dinner time. You wore the helmet to the grocery store. Your mother made you take it off before you went inside. You put it back on in the parking lot. You were 7 years old and you were in the army, and nobody was going to make you a civilian in a parking lot. The whirlybird helicopter flew. Not well, not far, not in any direction you intended. But it flew. Fly them from battlefield to battlefield, the commercial said, and you believed it because you wanted to believe it. And when the helicopter lifted off the ground for 3 seconds and then nosedived into the lawn, you called that flying. The Barracuda atomic submarine ran on batteries and dove underwater in the bathtub or the swimming pool, and you pretended it was hunting Soviet subs in the Atlantic because it was 1962 and everybody was hunting Soviet subs in the Atlantic. The screaming me rifle made a sound when you pulled the trigger that was somewhere between a screech and a whistle, and that sound carried through the entire house and into the neighbor's yard, and your mother told you to stop. And you stopped for 5 minutes, and then you pulled the trigger again because the sound was too good to not make. And then television changed everything. Remco understood something that no other toy company had figured out yet. If a boy watched a show on Wednesday night, he wanted to live in that show on Thursday morning. Not just think about it, yet live in it. With plastic and batteries and sound effects in his own 2 hands. And Remco was faster than anyone at turning a television show into a toy. When Lost in Space became one of the biggest shows in America in 1965, Remco was ready. They made the robot, a battery-powered, walking, talking, light-flashing version of the B-9 environmental control robot that said "Danger, Will Robinson" in every living room in the country. It was 2 feet tall, it walked on its own, its chest plate flashed red. It was the most impressive piece of licensed television merchandise any boy had ever seen. And if you had one, every kid on your block came to your house after school to watch it walk across the floor and fall off the table. They made a space helmet, a full-size clear plastic dome that went over your head and had a built-in microphone and flashing lights around the rim. You wore it in the backyard and you were Will Robinson. Not pretending, being. The helmet made it real because the helmet looked like the show, and the show was real on Wednesday night, so the helmet was real on Thursday morning. That was the logic of being 8 years old, and Remco understood it perfectly. When Batman exploded in 1966, and it did explode, it was the biggest thing on television twice a week, the whole country watching. Remco was there too. They made the Batmobile dashboard, a big plastic console with a working steering wheel, gear shift, bat horn, and control switches that you set up on the floor and sat behind and pretended you were driving through Gotham City in the most famous car on television. You made screeching tire sounds with your mouth. You called your friend on the Batman wrist radio, a working transistor radio on a band around your wrist, just like the one Adam West wore on the show. You were not a boy sitting on the floor of his bedroom with a plastic dashboard. You were Batman. And the kid down the street with the Robin mask was Robin. And the girl next door was Catwoman, whether she wanted to be or not. They made Beatles figures, 4 plastic versions of John, Paul, George, and Ringo that every girl in America wanted and that boys pretended they did not want, but secretly kept on their shelf. They made Star Trek figures. They made Munsters figures and a Munster coach that drove across the floor with Herman Munster grinning behind the wheel. Whatever was on television, whatever boys were watching, whatever was the biggest thing in the country that week, Remco made a toy out of it before any other company could get to the factory. Fast, cheap, loud, battery-powered, and on every single commercial, at the end, the same 6 words, "Every boy wants a Remco toy." The men who built all of this were not Hollywood executives, they were not Madison Avenue marketers, they were not businessmen in suits who had studied markets and demographics and consumer behavior. They were 2 cousins from Brooklyn whose parents had come to America from Russia with nothing and who raised their sons to believe that if you could build something with your hands, you could build a life. Isaac Heller, everyone called him Ike, was born in 1926 in Ellenville, New York, the son of Morris Heller and Yetta Shapiro, Russian Jewish immigrants. He grew up in Brooklyn, went to Brooklyn Technical High School, and joined the United States Navy, where he served as an electronics technician. That is where everything started. In the Navy, surrounded by radio equipment, radar systems, communication devices, and electronic components that the military discarded by the ton, Heller started building toys. As a hobby. He took apart a walkie-talkie that was headed for the scrap pile and rebuilt it smaller. He took a motor from a broken generator and put it in a wooden box with wheels. He was a man who could look at a pile of military surplus and see a childhood. Saul Robbins was born in 1922 in Brooklyn, Heller's cousin. He went to Rutgers University and then served in the United States Army during World War II. When both men came home from the war, one from the Navy, one from the Army, both from the same family, both from the same block in Brooklyn, they found themselves in a basement in New York City with an idea and a pile of parts. The idea was simple. Take the military surplus that nobody wanted, the walkie-talkie components, the motors, the switches, the wiring, the battery casings, the electronic parts that the government was selling by the truckload for pennies, and turn it into toys. Not delicate toys, not quiet toys, not toys that sat on a shelf and looked pretty. Loud toys, toys that moved and fired and flew and rolled and beeped and crackled and drove your mother insane and made your father say, "Will you turn that thing off?" Those toys. The toys that boys actually wanted. They named the company Remco, short for remote control, because every toy they made did something from a distance. You pushed a button over here and the tank moved over there. That was the magic. That was the whole company in 2 words. Remote control. You are in charge. You push the button. The thing obeys. They became the first toy company in America to advertise on television. Before Mattel, before Hasbro, before anyone. They understood, before anyone else in the toy industry, that if you showed a boy a toy on a screen, showed it moving, showed it firing, showed it flying, showed it doing the things that a boy wished he could do, that boy would not rest until he had it, and his mother would not rest until she bought it. And the 6 words that played at the end of every commercial were not a slogan. They were a fact. Every boy did want a Remco toy. The commercials made sure of it. In 1966, Heller and Robbins sold the company. They were done. They had built it from a pile of surplus in a basement to one of the biggest toy companies in America in 17 years, and they walked away to do other things. Heller went into commercial real estate. He built industrial parks. He founded a child care center in Edison, New Jersey, a place where other people's children could play and learn, because the man who had given a generation of boys their childhoods wanted to give something quieter, something kinder to the next one. Robbins went into business. Both men disappeared from the toy industry as completely as if they had never been there. Without the 2 men who had started it, who had understood in their bones what a boy wanted because they had been boys who wanted things, Remco lasted 5 years. 5 years. The company filed for bankruptcy in 1971. The magic was gone because the magicians had left. The factories in Harrison, New Jersey closed. The machines that had stamped out Bulldog tanks and Screaming Me rifles and Monkey Division helmets were silenced. The molds were sold to whoever would buy them. The inventory was liquidated. The brand name, those 2 syllables that had ended 1,000 television commercials, the name that every boy in America had heard more times than he had heard his own middle name, was bought by Azrak Hamway International, a company that used it to sell monster figures in the 1980s. In 1997, Jakks Pacific bought what was left of the name. Today, Remco exists only as a trademark on a piece of paper in a filing cabinet. There is no factory, there is no basement, there are no cousins building toys from military surplus, there is no voice on the television saying the 6 words that a generation of boys knew by heart. Saul Robbins died on June 13, 2010. He was 88 years old. He had outlived his company by 39 years. Isaac Heller died on March 7, 2015. He was 88 years old. He had outlived his company by 44 years. Both men reached the exact same age. Both men left behind the same legacy, a company that existed for 22 years and shaped the childhood of every boy who owned a television set between 1954 and 1971. The New York Times obituary for Isaac Heller described what Remco made as boyhood in a box, batteries not included. That is the most accurate description of any toy company in the history of American manufacturing. Boyhood in a box, batteries not included. You had to supply your own batteries, and you did. By the case, every boy wanted a Remco toy, and now every boy is a man, and the man remembers. He remembers the weight of the walkie-talkie in his hand, the sound of the screaming me in the hallway, the smell of the batteries when they got hot, the sight of the Bulldog Tank grinding to a stop on the kitchen floor, the feeling, the absolute certainty that if he had enough batteries he could do anything. He still feels it right now. He just needs more batteries.